Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of history's most fascinatingly morbid rabbit holes. So go ahead and dim those lights. Grab your favorite blanket, maybe put your phone on silent, because we're about to spend the next hour and a half exploring why our Victorian ancestors had some truly bizarre ideas about death, grief, and what constitutes appropriate bedroom arrangements. Trust me, by the time we're done here, you'll never look at old family portraits the same way again. And honestly, you might sleep a little better knowing that modern funeral homes exist for a reason. So picture this. It's 1850-something. You're living in a nice Victorian home with your extended family, and Great Aunt Millicent has just passed away peacefully in her sleep. What do? Well, if you're a proper Victorian, you certainly don't call the funeral director right away. Oh no. First, you're going to spend the next 3 to 7 days having sleepovers with Aunt Millicent's corpse, because apparently leaving dead relatives alone was considered rude. Now, before you start thinking this was some kind of weird Victorian fetish, let me explain. This practice, known as watching or waking, served several supposedly practical purposes. First, there was always that lingering fear that maybe, just maybe, dear Aunt Millicent wasn't actually dead. You know, just having a really long nap. Medical knowledge in the Victorian era was about as reliable as a chocolate teapot, so the concept of apparent death genuinely terrified people. Stories circulated constantly about people waking up in their coffins, scratching at the lids, desperately trying to escape their premature burials. So naturally, the solution was to keep the body at home for several days, taking shifts to watch for any signs of life. Family members would literally sleep in the same room, often in chairs positioned right next to the bed where the deceased lay. They'd watch for breathing, listen for heartbeats, look for any tiny movement that might indicate their loved one was just having the world's most convincing death impression. But here's where it gets really interesting. And by interesting, I mean deeply uncomfortable by modern standards. Sometimes, especially with children or spouses, family members wouldn't just sleep in the same room. They'd actually share the bed with the corpse. Yes, you heard that right. Grieving parents would spend nights cuddled up next to their dead children, and widows or widowers would sleep beside their deceased spouses for days on end. This wasn't just about checking for signs of life anymore. This was grief manifesting in ways that would make modern therapists reach for their strongest prescription pads. The Victorians had this romanticized notion about death being just another form of sleep, a gentle transition rather than a harsh ending. So in their minds, sleeping next to their loved ones was just ... continuing their normal routine, really. A final few nights of togetherness before the eternal separation. The whole thing was made even more surreal by Victorian funeral traditions. Bodies weren't immediately embalmed and whisked away to funeral homes like they are today. Instead, they were washed, dressed in their finest clothes, and arranged in the family's best bed, or sometimes on a table in the parlor. The room would be decorated with flowers, candles would be lit, and mirrors would be covered or turned to face the wall, because apparently reflective surfaces were considered portals for restless spirits or something equally cheerful. Family members would take turns sitting vigil, but it wasn't uncommon for exhausted relatives to simply climb into bed next to their deceased loved one when their watch shift ended. After all, Someone had to keep the body company, and Victorian houses weren't exactly overflowing with spare bedrooms. Practical considerations mixed with grief in ways that created some genuinely bizarre sleeping arrangements. The practice was especially common in rural areas, where medical professionals were scarce and the nearest doctor might be days away. Families couldn't be entirely certain someone was actually dead until decomposition made it, shall we say, undeniably obvious. So they'd wait and watch and sleep alongside corpses, because that's just what responsible family members did in the 1800s. But let's talk about Queen Victoria herself. Because if anyone was going to take mourning to absolutely ridiculous extremes, it was going to be the monarch whose entire era was named after her. When Prince Albert died in 1861, Victoria didn't just enter a period of mourning. She basically turned mourning into a competitive sport and declared herself the undisputed champion. Albert died of typhoid fever, or possibly Crohn's disease, or maybe just the crushing weight of being married to Victoria for 21 years. The official cause was typhoid, but honestly, Victorian medical diagnosis was about as accurate as a weather forecast written by a blindfolded parrot. Whatever killed him, he died at Windsor Castle on December 14, 1861. And Victoria's reaction was, well, let's just say she made other Victorian widows look positively cheerful by comparison. First, she ordered that Albert's bedroom at Windsor Castle be kept exactly as it was on the day he died. His clothes were laid out fresh every morning for the next 40 years. His wash basin was filled with fresh water daily. His chambers were cleaned and maintained as if he might walk back in at any moment. This wasn't just for a few weeks or months of grieving. This continued until Victoria's own death in 1901. 40 years of pretending her dead husband was just out running errands. But here's where Victoria's mourning practices get properly weird. She didn't just preserve Albert's rooms like museums. She actually continued sleeping with items that had belonged to him, including his nightshirt. She'd hold his clothing while she slept, and sometimes she'd place pieces of his clothing on the empty side of her bed as if he were still there beside her. Now, this might sound sweet in a tragic, romantic way, except Victoria took it several steps further into genuinely unsettling territory. She had plaster casts made of Albert's hands, and she'd hold these cold, lifeless replicas while she slept. Imagine trying to get a good night's rest while spooning with a plaster cast of your dead husband's hand. It's like something out of a gothic horror novel, except this was the Queen of England's actual bedtime routine. Victoria also commissioned numerous death masks and photographs of Albert's corpse, which was absolutely normal by Victorian standards. The Victorians were obsessed with post-mortem photography, treating it as a final opportunity to capture their loved ones' likenesses. But Victoria went beyond just having the photographs taken. She kept them beside her bed and would look at images of Albert's dead face before going to sleep each night. And if that wasn't quite morbid enough, Victoria also started sleeping with Albert's nightgown and various personal items spread across her bed, creating what was essentially a shrine to her dead husband that she crawled into every night. She'd arrange his belongings as if he were lying there next to her, then curl up beside them. This wasn't just grief. This was grief that had been pickled in Victorian. sensibilities and left to ferment for 4 decades. But Victoria was hardly unique in her posthumous sleeping arrangements. The Victorian middle and upper classes had turned elaborate mourning into something of an art form, and that art frequently involved sharing sleeping spaces with the deceased. It was considered both proper and necessary, a way of showing respect and ensuring that the dead weren't left alone during their final nights in the family home. Take the case of the Browning family, for example. When Elizabeth Barrett Browning died in Italy in 1861, her husband Robert arranged for her body to be kept in their bedroom for several days while he made arrangements for the funeral. But here's the thing that made Victorian eyebrows raise. Even by Victorian standards, Robert continued sleeping in the same bed as Elizabeth's corpse, not beside it, but literally in the same bed. Robert claimed he was too distraught to sleep elsewhere, and frankly, given that this was the same man who had eloped with Elizabeth despite her father's violent objections, no one was particularly surprised by his dramatic approach to grief. He'd wake up in the middle of the night and have conversations with Elizabeth's body, asking her questions and waiting for answers that never came. The servants reported hearing him talking to her corpse at all hours, sometimes reading his poetry aloud as if she were still able to critique his metaphors. Now, you might be wondering how Victorian society justified these practices, especially given that they were generally quite prudish about anything remotely resembling impropriety. Well, death apparently had a way of suspending normal social rules. The Victorian concept of appropriate went out the window when someone died, replaced by elaborate rituals that would have seemed absolutely insane in any other context. For instance, it was considered perfectly acceptable for unmarried siblings to share beds with their deceased brothers or sisters, something that would have scandalized Victorian society under any other circumstances. Widows and widowers were encouraged to maintain physical closeness with their dead spouses as a way of easing the transition from married life to widowhood. Children were often placed in beds with deceased grandparents or other relatives, because apparently traumatizing the next generation was just part of the Victorian mourning process. That the whole thing was rationalized through a combination of medical ignorance, religious beliefs, and social customs that had been marinating in grief for generations. Victorians believed that the soul didn't immediately leave the body upon death, but instead lingered for several days before making its final departure. During this transitional period, it was considered important to keep the deceased comfortable and accompanied, just as you would for a living person who was seriously ill. Religious leaders actually encouraged these practices, preaching that maintaining vigil over the dead was a Christian duty. They argued that Jesus himself had been watched over during the 3 days between his death and resurrection. So, obviously, proper Christians should extend the same courtesy to their deceased family members. Never mind that Jesus was laid in a tomb, not tucked into bed with his grieving relatives. But Victorian religious logic wasn't always particularly concerned with biblical accuracy. The medical establishment, such as it was, also supported prolonged home vigils. Victorian doctors genuinely feared premature burial, partly because their diagnostic skills were about as reliable as a chocolate fireguard, and partly because they'd heard enough stories about people waking up in coffins to give them nightmares. So they recommended keeping bodies at home for observation, just in case someone who appeared dead was actually just having a really bad day. This medical paranoia wasn't entirely unfounded, mind you. Victorian medicine was still operating under some pretty questionable assumptions about how human bodies worked. They didn't fully understand the difference between unconsciousness and death. They had no reliable way to check for brain activity, and their methods for determining whether someone's heart had stopped beating were primitive. So yes, there probably were cases where people who appeared dead were actually just deeply unconscious, making the practice of prolonged observation somewhat sensible, even if the sleeping arrangements were deeply weird. But here's where Victorian death customs get even more elaborate and strange. It wasn't just about sleeping with corpses. Oh no, that was just the beginning of a mourning process that could drag on for years and involved some truly peculiar traditions. For example, Victorian families would often continue setting places at the dinner table for their deceased relatives, complete with full meals that would sit untouched while everyone else ate around the empty chair. They'd maintain the deceased person's bedroom exactly as it had been, sometimes for decades, changing the sheets regularly and dusting the furniture as if their loved one might return at any moment. They'd commission elaborate mourning jewelry made from the hair of the deceased, creating brooches and rings that literally incorporated pieces of dead people into fashionable accessories. And speaking of hair, Victorians had some truly bizarre ideas about posthumous hair collection. It was common practice to cut locks of hair from the deceased, not just as keepsakes, but to weave into elaborate memorial artworks. Entire family trees would be constructed out of dead relatives' hair, framed and hung on parlor walls like macabre genealogical charts. Hair from deceased children was particularly prized, often braided into jewelry that mothers would wear for the rest of their lives. Now, you might think that sleeping with corpses and wearing dead people's hair as accessories represents the absolute peak of Victorian mourning weirdness, but you'd be wrong, because we haven't even talked about Victorian seances yet. And trust me, that's where things get properly unhinged. The Victorian era coincided with the rise of spiritualism, a religious movement that claimed the living could communicate with the dead through mediums, seances, and various supernatural shenanigans. For grieving Victorians who had spent days sleeping next to their deceased relatives, the idea that death wasn't really the end of the relationship was incredibly appealing. Seances became wildly popular, especially among the upper classes who had the time and money to spend on elaborate supernatural entertainment. Families who had lost loved ones would gather in darkened parlors, join hands around tables, and attempt to contact the spirits of their deceased relatives. And here's the really unsettling part. Many of these seances were conducted in the same rooms where the families had recently been sleeping with corpses. So picture this absolutely delightful scene. You're a wealthy Victorian family. You've just spent 3 days sleeping with great-uncle Reginald's corpse, and now you've decided that what this situation really needs is to invite some neighbors over for an evening of supernatural entertainment. Because apparently, having intimate sleepovers with dead relatives wasn't quite weird enough. So, Victorian society decided to turn death into a group activity. The seance craze really took off after the Civil War in America and the Crimean War in Britain, when suddenly every family had lost someone and everyone was desperately looking for ways to reconnect with their dead loved ones. The Victorians, never ones to do anything halfway, threw themselves into spiritualism with the same enthusiasm they brought to elaborate mourning rituals and sleeping with corpses. Medium services became as fashionable as having the right wallpaper pattern. Wealthy families would hire professional mediums to conduct seances in their homes, often in the very rooms where they'd been maintaining vigils over deceased relatives. There was something deeply appealing about the idea that all those nights spent sleeping next to dead family members had somehow created a spiritual connection that could be maintained even after burial. The Fox sisters in New York became international celebrities by claiming they could communicate with spirits through mysterious rapping sounds. Never mind that they later confessed to making the sounds by cracking their toe joints. Victorian society was absolutely enchanted by the possibility that death wasn't really the end of family relationships. And honestly, given how much effort they'd already put into maintaining physical closeness with their dead relatives, the leap to spiritual communication probably seemed like a natural progression. But here's where Victorian death customs get really interesting from a social perspective. All of this elaborate mourning, the sleeping with corpses, the seances, the hair jewelry, it wasn't just about grief. It was about displaying your social status and your family's emotional sophistication. The Victorian upper classes had turned mourning into a competitive sport, and the families who could afford the most elaborate death rituals were essentially showing off their wealth and refinement. Consider the case of the Carlyle family, wealthy Manchester industrialists who lost their youngest daughter to scarlet fever in 1873. Their response to little Charlotte's death reads like a manual for Victorian mourning excess. First, they kept her body at home for 6 days, with family members taking shifts, sleeping in her bedroom. Her mother, Mrs. Eleanor Carlyle, spent every night of that week curled up in Charlotte's small bed, holding the child's corpse and singing lullabies to her dead daughter. After the funeral, the Carlyles preserved Charlotte's bedroom exactly as it had been, down to the toys scattered on the floor and the half-finished embroidery project on her little desk. They hired a professional medium to conduct weekly seances in the room. Attempting to contact Charlotte's spirit, Mrs. Carlyle continued sleeping in Charlotte's bed for months, claiming that she could feel her daughter's presence more strongly there. But the Carlyles didn't stop there. They commissioned a life-sized wax figure of Charlotte, dressed in her favorite frock and positioned in her bedroom as if she were simply sleeping. Mrs. Carlyle would hold conversations with this wax duplicate, read her stories, and yes, sometimes sleep curled up next to it. The local newspapers wrote admiringly about the family's dedication to their departed child, as if creating a creepy wax shrine and sleeping with it was the height of parental devotion. Now, you might think that the Carlyles represent some kind of extreme case, but actually, their behavior was pretty typical for wealthy Victorian families dealing with the death of a child. In fact, if anything, they were showing admirable restraint compared to some of their contemporaries. Take Queen Victoria's daughter, Princess Alice, who lost her youngest daughter, Marie, to diphtheria in 1878. Alice didn't just sleep with the child's corpse for the traditional viewing period. She had the little girl's body preserved and kept in a special room in the palace for over a month, visiting daily to spend time with the corpse. Alice would read to the dead child, bring her favorite toys, and often fell asleep in chairs beside the preservation table. The really unsettling part is that Alice's surviving children were expected to participate in these visits, essentially being forced to maintain relationships with their dead sister's corpse. They'd be brought in to say goodnight to Marie's body, to place flowers beside her, and to sit quietly while their mother had one-sided conversations with the deceased child. And this wasn't considered child abuse or psychological trauma by Victorian standards. This was considered proper grief education, teaching children about the natural cycle of life and death and the importance of maintaining family bonds beyond the grave. Victorian child-rearing manuals actually recommended including living children in mourning rituals as a way of building character and spiritual depth. But let's shift our focus to some of the more, shall we say, creative sleeping arrangements that Victorian mourning customs produced. Because sleeping next to corpses was apparently just the beginning of posthumous cohabitation possibilities, the Ashworth family of Yorkshire provides a particularly memorable example. When the family patriarch, Thomas Ashworth, died in 1869, his widow Sarah not only slept beside his corpse during the traditional viewing period, but she also had his body moved to their marriage bed and continued sleeping next to it for 2 weeks after the funeral was supposed to have taken place. Sarah claimed that Thomas had appeared to her in a dream and requested more time at home before being buried. The family physician, Dr. Pemberton, was apparently concerned about the sanitary implications of keeping a decomposing corpse in a bedroom for extended periods. But Sarah insisted that Thomas looked perfectly peaceful and showed no signs of decay. Dr. Pemberton's notes, preserved in the local medical society archives, suggest that Sarah had essentially mummified her husband through some combination of Victorian preservation techniques and sheer force of will. The situation became even more bizarre when Sarah started inviting female friends over for what she called evening visits with Thomas. These social calls involved groups of Victorian ladies sitting around Thomas's corpse, having tea and conversation as if he were simply an unusually quiet participant in their social gathering. Some of these ladies would stay overnight, sleeping in chairs arranged around the marriage bed, where Sarah continued to sleep next to her increasingly well-preserved husband. This went on for nearly 3 weeks before local authorities finally intervened. Not because they were concerned about Sarah's mental state, but because neighbors had complained about the smell. Even by Victorian standards, keeping a corpse as a permanent houseguest was pushing the boundaries of acceptable mourning behavior. But Thomas Ashworth's extended homestay was hardly the most elaborate example of Victorian posthumous domesticity. That honor probably goes to the Pemberton family of London, who lost their adult son William in a hunting accident in 1883. William had been living at home with his parents and his unmarried sister, Catherine, and his death created what the family viewed as an unacceptable disruption to their household arrangements, so they decided not to disrupt them. William's body was embalmed by a family friend who had some experience with preservation techniques, and then he was simply kept at home. His parents continued to set a place for him at dinner. His sister continued to include him in her evening prayers. And yes, family members continued to sleep in his room, treating his preserved corpse as if he were just a very quiet, very still houseguest. The Pembertons maintained this arrangement for over 2 months, during which time they hosted dinner parties, tea socials, and even a small Christmas celebration with William's corpse propped up in his favorite chair. Guests were expected to greet William upon arrival and to include him in their conversations, asking his opinion on various topics, and then pausing politely as if waiting for his response. Catherine Pemberton apparently found great comfort in sleeping in her deceased brother's room, often curling up in a chair beside his preserved form while reading aloud from his favorite books. She'd hold his hand while she read, sometimes falling asleep while still grasping his cold, lifeless fingers. The family physician later noted that Catherine seemed genuinely convinced that William was simply in a very deep sleep and would eventually wake up if they just maintained their normal routines long enough. Whole thing came to an end only when a kitchen fire forced the family to temporarily evacuate their home, and the authorities who responded to the fire discovered William's preserved corpse tucked into his bedroom like some kind of Victorian version of Weekend at Bernie's. Even then, the family was more concerned about finding alternative accommodation for William than they were about the legal implications of keeping a dead body as a permanent houseguest. Now, if you're starting to think that all of this sounds like the Victorian era was just one big psychological experiment in collective insanity, you're not entirely wrong. But it's important to understand that these practices weren't emerging from nowhere. They were the logical extension of Victorian attitudes toward death, family, and social propriety that had been developing for generations. The Victorians lived in an era when death was ever present. Child mortality rates were astronomical. Diseases like tuberculosis and cholera could wipe out entire families within weeks. And medical care was about as effective as treating pneumonia with positive thinking and herbal tea. In a world where death could arrive without warning and take anyone at any time, elaborate mourning rituals served as a way of asserting some kind of control over the uncontrollable. Sleeping with corpses, maintaining elaborate shrines to the dead, wearing mourning jewelry made from deceased relatives' hair. It all served to extend the relationship beyond death and to demonstrate that love and family bonds were stronger than mere mortality. It was also a way of showing that your family had the emotional sophistication and financial resources to properly honor the dead. But there was also a darker side to these elaborate mourning practices. The pressure to demonstrate appropriate grief could be overwhelming, especially for Victorian women, who were expected to embody the era's romantic ideals about feminine sensitivity and emotional depth. Widows like Queen Victoria, who spent 40 years in mourning, weren't just expressing personal grief. They were performing a kind of theatrical widowhood that had become socially expected, culturally celebrated. The result was a society where normal grief responses were amplified into elaborate public performances, and where the line between genuine mourning and social obligation became increasingly blurred. Women who didn't seem sufficiently devastated by their husbands' deaths faced social criticism, while those who took their mourning to extremes were praised for their devotion and emotional authenticity. This created some genuinely problematic situations. Young widows who might have been ready to remarry and start new lives found themselves trapped by social expectations that demanded years of elaborate mourning performances. Children were forced to participate in mourning rituals that were often more about adult social expectations than about helping them process their grief in healthy ways. And the sleeping arrangements, the intimate physical contact with corpses that we've been discussing. This wasn't always entirely consensual. Children were often required to sleep in rooms with deceased relatives, not because they found it comforting, but because Victorian mourning protocols demanded it. Servants were expected to participate in family mourning rituals, including sleeping arrangements that may have made them deeply uncomfortable. The whole system created a kind of mourning hierarchy, where families competed to demonstrate the most elaborate grief responses, and where failure to participate enthusiastically in posthumous sleeping arrangements could be seen as a sign of insufficient love or inadequate moral character. Now, let's drift into the fascinating world of Victorian death commerce. Because where there's elaborate social ritual, there's always someone ready to make a profit. The Victorian obsession with posthumous intimacy and extended mourning periods created an entire industry dedicated to helping families maintain appropriate relationships with their dead relatives. And trust me, when Victorians decided to commercialize something, they went absolutely all-in. The most obvious beneficiaries of these extended corpse-keeping traditions were the emerging embalming specialists. Before the Victorian era, body preservation was pretty much limited to ancient Egyptian pharaohs and the occasional European monarch. But suddenly, with families wanting to keep their loved ones at home for weeks or even months, there was a booming market for preservation services. Enter Dr. Augustus Reneward, who became something of a celebrity in Victorian London by perfecting what he called domestic embalming for the devoted family. His advertisement in the London Times promised to preserve deceased relatives in lifelike repose for extended home visitations, allowing families to maintain natural intimacy during the grieving process. Dr. Reneward's services didn't come cheap. A basic preservation package cost roughly 6 months' wages for a working-class family, which meant that extended corpse-keeping was definitely a luxury service. But for wealthy Victorian families, the expense was just another way of demonstrating their devotion and their financial capacity to honor the dead. Properly, the really entrepreneurial part of Dr. Reneward's business model was his follow-up services. He didn't just preserve bodies and leave families to figure out the rest. He offered grief maintenance consultations, where he'd visit bereaved families weekly to check on both the condition of the corpse and the emotional state of the relatives who were sleeping with it. His preserved notebooks, discovered in a London estate sale in the 1920s, provide some absolutely fascinating insights into Victorian posthumous domesticity. For example, he records a visit to the Whitmore family in 1878, where the recently widowed Mrs. Elizabeth Whitmore had been sleeping beside her husband's preserved corpse for 6 weeks. Dr. notes that Mrs. Whitmore had developed an elaborate bedtime routine that involved undressing her dead husband each night and putting him in fresh night clothes, then positioning his arms around her as she slept. She'd wake up each morning and dress him again for the day, combing his hair and arranging his limbs in natural-looking poses. According to Reneward's notes, Mrs. Whitmore insisted that her husband looked forward to their evening routine and seemed more peaceful when she included him in her normal domestic activities. The good doctor, apparently, saw nothing particularly unusual about this arrangement. His notes focus primarily on the technical aspects of preservation, noting that Mr. Whitmore's body was maintaining excellent color and flexibility. Despite 6 weeks of nightly manipulation, he recommended that Mrs. Whitmore continue her current routine, but perhaps consider moving to a cooler bedroom to slow decomposition. But Dr. Reneward wasn't the only entrepreneur capitalizing on Victorian death culture. The era also saw the rise of specialized mourning furniture designed specifically for families who wanted to keep deceased relatives at home for extended periods. Companies like Thornley and Sons manufactured elaborate mourning beds that were essentially pieces of furniture designed to display corpses in home settings. These weren't just regular beds with dead people in them. They were specially constructed pieces with built-in drainage systems, preservation chambers, and adjustable positioning mechanisms that allowed families to arrange their deceased relatives in lifelike poses. The most expensive models included heating and cooling systems to help control decomposition, and some even had built-in music boxes that could play the deceased's favorite songs on a continuous loop. The advertising for these mourning beds reads like something out of a Gothic horror novel, but they were marketed as practical solutions for devoted families. One advertisement promised the comfort and dignity of home arrangements for your beloved departed, allowing for natural family intimacy during the sacred grieving period. Thornley and Sons also manufactured what they called companion sleeping furniture for family members who wanted to sleep near their preserved relatives but weren't quite ready to share a bed with a corpse. These were essentially matching bedroom sets designed to accommodate both the living and the dead in the same sleeping space. The most elaborate example was probably the Eternal Rest Suite, which featured a central preservation bed surrounded by smaller sleeping alcoves for family members. The whole thing was arranged so that up to 4 living relatives could sleep within arm's reach of their deceased loved one, creating what the company's catalog described as a peaceful family circle extending beyond mortal boundaries. If specialized corpse furniture sounds like the height of Victorian commercial exploitation of grief, wait until you hear about the mourning photography industry. The Victorians were absolutely obsessed with post-mortem photography, but they took it several steps beyond just taking pictures of dead people. Professional mourning photographers like James Sinclair offered what they called eternal family portrait services. These weren't just photographs of the deceased lying in their coffins. These were elaborate, staged family portraits that included both living and dead relatives arranged in natural-looking domestic scenes. Sinclair's most popular package was the family bedtime portrait, where deceased relatives were positioned in beds surrounded by their living family members, all posed as if they were simply having a peaceful night's sleep together. The living family members would actually sleep in these arranged positions for several hours while Sinclair prepared his photographic equipment, ensuring that everyone looked naturally relaxed and comfortable in the final image. The photographs that survive from these sessions are genuinely unsettling. You see Victorian families arranged in beds with their dead relatives, everyone smiling peacefully as if sharing a bed with a corpse was the most natural thing in the world. Children are positioned curled up against dead grandparents. Spouses are photographed holding hands with their deceased partners, and everyone looks absolutely delighted about the sleeping arrangements. But here's the thing that makes these photographs even more disturbing. They weren't just keepsakes for private family viewing. Victorian families displayed these posthumous bedtime portraits in their parlors, showed them to visitors, and sometimes even sent them as holiday cards to distant relatives. Imagine receiving a Christmas greeting featuring your cousin's family cuddled up in bed with their dead grandmother, everyone grinning at the camera as if this were perfectly normal seasonal entertainment. The demand for mourning photography became so intense that some photographers actually specialized in what they called lifestyle death portraits. These were ongoing photographic relationships where photographers would visit bereaved families regularly to document their evolving relationships with their deceased relatives. For example, photographer Margaret Henley worked with the Morrison family of Edinburgh for over a year, documenting how the family integrated their dead son Robert into their daily routines. Her photographs show Robert's corpse positioned at the breakfast table, tucked into bed with his living siblings, and even propped up in the garden during family picnics. The Morrison family apparently treasured these photographs as evidence of their continued family unity despite Robert's death. They'd show the images to visitors as proof of their devotion and their success in maintaining family bonds beyond the grave. The photographs were eventually compiled into a family album titled Our Year with Robert, which was displayed proudly on the parlor table for anyone who came to call. Now, while all of this commercial exploitation was flourishing, the medical establishment was starting to raise some concerns about the health implications of extended corpse-keeping. Victorian doctors may not have understood much about disease transmission, but they were beginning to notice some patterns among families who maintained prolonged intimate contact with their dead relatives. Dr. Edward Hartwell published a paper in the British Medical Journal in 1879 titled Observations on Domestic Mortality Arrangements and Their Health Consequences. His research included interviews with over 50 families who had kept deceased relatives at home for extended periods, and his findings were, well, let's just say they weren't entirely reassuring. Dr. Hartwell found that families who slept with corpses for more than a week showed significantly higher rates of respiratory illness, skin conditions, and what he described as nervous complaints. Children who were required to share sleeping spaces with dead relatives were particularly prone to what Victorian medicine called melancholic dispositions and spiritual disturbances. But perhaps most concerning, Dr. Hartwell documented several cases where family members who had maintained intimate contact with deceased relatives began showing signs of what he termed posthumous attachment disorder. These individuals became so emotionally dependent on their relationships with corpses that they struggled to function when the bodies were finally buried. The case studies in his paper read like something out of a Victorian Gothic novel. He describes Mrs. Caroline Fitzgerald, who kept her husband's preserved corpse in their marriage bed for 4 months and became so attached to their nightly routine that she suffered a complete nervous breakdown when local authorities finally forced her to bury him. Then there was the Pembroke family, where 3 generations of women had maintained sleeping arrangements with various deceased relatives over a period of several years. According to Dr. Hartwell's notes, the house had essentially become a domestic mortuary, with preserved corpses in multiple bedrooms, and living family members rotating between different posthumous sleeping partners depending on their emotional needs. Dr. Hartwell's research suggested that extended intimate contact with corpses was creating a kind of addictive cycle, where bereaved individuals became psychologically dependent on maintaining physical relationships with their dead relatives. The longer these arrangements continued, the more difficult it became for the living family members to accept that their loved ones were actually gone. But despite these medical concerns, or perhaps because of them, the Victorian mourning industry continued to expand and elaborate. New businesses emerged to serve every aspect of extended corpse-keeping, from specialized linens designed for posthumous bed sharing to consulting services that helped families plan elaborate mourning schedules. The most successful of these enterprises was probably Blackwood and Associates, a London firm that offered comprehensive domestic mourning management. Their services included everything from corpse preservation and positioning to family counseling designed to help relatives adjust to sleeping with dead people. Client roster read like a who's who of Victorian high society. They managed mourning arrangements for members of Parliament, wealthy industrialists, and even minor royalty. Their approach was remarkably systematic. They'd arrive at a family's home within hours of a death, take charge of all practical arrangements, and then provide ongoing support throughout what they called the domestic grieving period. Their standard package included daily corpse maintenance, weekly family counseling sessions, and what they termed grief coordination services. This last bit involved helping families establish sleeping schedules that allowed multiple relatives to take turns spending nights with the deceased, ensuring that nobody had to sleep alone with a corpse unless they specifically requested private time. The company's founder, Mortimer Blackwood, had apparently started the business after his own experience, keeping his wife's corpse at home for 3 months following her death from consumption. He'd developed what he considered a scientific approach to posthumous domesticity, with detailed protocols for everything from optimal room temperature for corpse preservation to recommended conversation topics for families who wanted to maintain dialogue with their dead relatives. Blackwood's client notes, preserved in the company archives, provide some absolutely fascinating insights into how Victorian families actually lived with their dead relatives. For example, the Ashford family hired Blackwood and Associates to help manage their mourning arrangements when the family matriarch, Lady Margaret Ashford, died in 1884. According to Blackwood's notes, Lady, center of a household that included her husband, 4 adult children, and several grandchildren. The family was devastated by the prospect of adjusting to life without her, so they decided simply not to adjust. Blackwood helped them establish a routine where Lady Margaret's preserved corpse remained in the master bedroom, and different family members took turns sleeping with her on a rotating schedule. Her husband got Sunday and Monday nights. Her eldest daughter took Tuesday and Wednesday. Her son claimed Thursday and Friday. And her youngest daughter got Saturday nights plus alternate weekends. The arrangement worked so well that the family continued it for over 6 months, with Blackwood providing ongoing preservation services and family counseling to help manage the logistics. His notes indicate that family members actually began looking forward to their scheduled nights with Lady Margaret, treating them as special opportunities for private conversation and emotional connection. But the really remarkable thing about the Ashford arrangement was how it evolved over time. Initially, family members were simply sleeping in the same bed as Lady Margaret's corpse, positioning themselves carefully to avoid disturbing her peaceful pose. But gradually, they began incorporating more interactive elements into their nighttime routines. Her husband, Lord Charles Ashford, developed a habit of reading aloud to Lady Margaret's corpse before falling asleep, choosing from her favorite books and pausing occasionally to ask for her opinion on various plot developments. Her daughter Elizabeth would brush Lady Margaret's hair each night and arrange it in different styles, sometimes spending hours creating elaborate braided arrangements that she claimed her mother would have enjoyed. The grandchildren were initially excluded from the sleeping rotation, but they begged to be included, arguing that they missed their grandmother's bedtime stories. Eventually, the family established special story nights where the children would curl up in bed with Lady Margaret's corpse while one of the adults read fairy tales aloud. Notes suggest that he found these developments perfectly healthy and appropriate. He saw them as evidence that the family was successfully maintaining their emotional bonds with their deceased relative, and he encouraged them to continue expanding their posthumous domestic routines as long as they brought comfort to the living family members. Now, you might be wondering what eventually happened to families like the Ashfords, who had essentially turned corpse-keeping into a permanent lifestyle choice. Well, most of these extended mourning arrangements eventually came to an end. 6-month arrangement with Lady Margaret finally concluded, not because anyone decided it was time to let go, but because the preservation techniques available in the 1880s had their limits, and even Blackwood's expertise couldn't prevent the natural processes of decomposition indefinitely. According to his final report on the case, the decision to finally bury Lady Margaret was made during a family meeting where everyone acknowledged that their beloved matriarch was beginning to look less like herself and more like something that belonged in a medical school anatomy class. Even then, the family requested that Blackwood help them transition gradually from their corpse-sharing routine to more conventional mourning practices. The transition process took another month and involved slowly reducing the amount of time family members spent sleeping with Lady Margaret's corpse, replacing their intimate nighttime arrangements with daytime visits to her preserved body, and eventually moving to a twice-weekly schedule where family members would spend an hour or two sitting quietly beside her before she was finally buried, but not all extended mourning arrangements ended so gradually, amicably. Dr. Hartwell's research documented several cases where families had become so psychologically dependent on their posthumous sleeping arrangements that they violently resisted any attempts to separate them from their dead relatives. The most extreme case involved the Thornfield family of Manchester, who had maintained a rotating sleeping schedule with their deceased son Edmund for over a year. When local health authorities finally intervened to force burial of the increasingly decomposed corpse, the family barricaded themselves in their home and threatened to harm anyone who tried to remove Edmund's body. The standoff lasted for 3 days, with police and medical officials negotiating with family members who insisted that Edmund was still alive and simply sleeping very deeply. The situation was finally resolved when Edmund's sister Clara agreed to let medical professionals examine the body, but only if she could continue holding his hand throughout the examination. The medical report from that examination makes for some genuinely disturbing reading. Edmund's corpse had been so extensively handled and manipulated over the course of a year that it had essentially become a kind of grotesque puppet, with loose joints and detached limbs that the family had been repositioning and rearranging nightly for months. The truly heartbreaking part of the Thornfield case was that Clara's attachment to Edmund's corpse had become so complete that she genuinely seemed unable to distinguish between his dead body and his living presence. She'd developed elaborate conversations with the corpse, complete with different voices for Edmund's responses, and she'd convinced herself that his decomposition was actually just a temporary illness that would eventually resolve itself when authorities finally removed Edmund's remains for burial. Clara suffered what Victorian medicine would have called a complete nervous collapse. She spent several months in a private sanitarium, where doctors treated her condition as a form of grief-induced madness brought on by excessive posthumous intimacy. Now, let's float across the Atlantic and see how American society dealt with these Victorian death customs. Because if you thought British families sleeping with corpses was strange, wait until you see what happened when these practices crossed the ocean and got mixed up with American frontier pragmatism and Puritan religious sensibilities. American Victorian families embraced posthumous intimacy with the same enthusiasm they brought to everything else, which is to say, they took the basic concept and then amplified it to absolutely ridiculous extremes. The difference was that American families often lived in more isolated circumstances than their British counterparts, which meant that extended corpse-keeping wasn't just about elaborate mourning rituals. Sometimes it was a practical necessity born of weather, distance from towns, and the simple fact that the nearest cemetery might be a week's journey away through hostile terrain. The Johnson family of Montana provides a perfect example of how American practicality merged with Victorian death customs to create some truly memorable sleeping arrangements. When Patriarch William Johnson died during a blizzard in February 1879, his family found themselves snowed in for nearly 2 months with his corpse, because, apparently, Montana winters don't care about your funeral planning, but rather than treating this as an unfortunate situation to be endured, the Johnsons embraced it as an opportunity for extended family bonding. William's widow, Martha, established a sleeping schedule where different family members took turns sharing the bed with William's naturally frozen corpse, treating him like a very cold, very quiet house guest who just happened to be dead. The family's letters from that winter, preserved in the Montana Historical Society archives, read like a bizarre cross between Little House on the Prairie and a Gothic horror novel. Martha writes cheerfully about tucking William in each night and arranging his arms in comfortable positions. Their teenage daughter, Sarah, describes braiding her father's beard and styling his hair, treating his corpse like an unusually cooperative dress-up doll. Most remarkably, the family continued their normal domestic routines throughout those 2 months, setting places for William at dinner and including him in their evening prayers and conversation. When the snow finally melted enough for them to dig a grave, several family members expressed genuine sadness about ending their extended winter with William's perfectly preserved corpse. But the Montana Johnsons were hardly unusual by American standards. The Civil War had normalized intimate contact with dead bodies in ways that probably accelerated the acceptance of extended mourning practices. American families had spent 4 years dealing with unprecedented numbers of war casualties, often in circumstances where formal burial was impossible or delayed for extended periods. The result was a generation of Americans who had already experienced sleeping in proximity to corpses, whether on battlefields, in military hospitals, or in homes where wounded soldiers had died during recovery. By the time Victorian mourning customs became fashionable in American society, many families already had practical experience with posthumous domesticity. This created some uniquely American variations on British death customs. For example, American families were more likely to include deceased relatives in daily work routines, not just sleeping arrangements. Farmers would sometimes prop up dead relatives in chairs beside their workbenches, treating them as silent supervisors during daily chores. Families would include deceased children in their educational activities, reading lessons aloud to corpses and expecting living children to demonstrate their learning progress to their dead siblings. The most elaborate example was probably the Peterson family of Iowa, who lost their eldest son Carl to a farming accident in 1881. Rather than treating Carl's death as the end of his participation in family life, the Petersons incorporated his preserved corpse into their daily routines for the better part of a year. Carl had been the family's primary accountant, managing the farm's financial records and correspondence. After his death, his father would bring the account books to Carl's corpse each evening, reading aloud from the day's transactions and asking Carl's opinion on various business decisions. The family claimed that Carl would sometimes provide guidance through subtle changes in his facial expression, though it's possible that what they were interpreting as communication was just the natural effects of decomposition on facial tissues. The sleeping arrangements in the Peterson household were even more elaborate than the business consultations. Carl's mother had established a schedule where she spent 3 nights each week sleeping beside Carl's corpse. His younger brother took 2 nights, and his sister got the remaining 2 nights. But they didn't just sleep passively next to the body. Each family member had developed personalized bedtime routines that involved talking to Carl about their daily activities, their hopes and concerns, and their plans for the future. Carl's mother would undress and redress the corpse each night, changing his clothes and positioning his limbs in comfortable-looking poses. His brother would read aloud from agricultural journals, updating Carl on new farming techniques and asking for advice about crop rotation and livestock management. His sister would brush Carl's hair and trim his fingernails, maintaining his grooming as if he were simply a very sleepy family member who needed extra care. The Peterson family maintained this routine for 11 months, stopping only when Carl's corpse had deteriorated to the point where even their devoted preservation efforts couldn't maintain the illusion that he was simply sleeping. Even then, they buried him reluctantly, with several family members expressing the hope that they might be reunited with Karl in whatever posthumous sleeping arrangements awaited them in the afterlife. Now, while American families were adapting Victorian death customs to their own cultural and practical circumstances, European variations were developing in equally fascinating directions. French Victorian families, for example, approached posthumous intimacy with characteristic attention to aesthetic detail and social sophistication. The practice of sleeping with dead relatives became particularly elaborate among the French upper classes, who treated it as an opportunity to demonstrate their refined sensibilities and their mastery of complex social protocols. French mourning etiquette included specific rules about appropriate conversation topics for posthumous bedtime discussions, proper positioning for corpses and living relatives sharing sleeping spaces, and suitable clothing choices for both the living and the dead during these intimate arrangements. The Beaumont family of Paris became somewhat legendary in French society for their approach to posthumous domesticity after the death of their daughter Isabel in 1878. Rather than simply keeping Isabel's corpse at home for a traditional viewing period, they transformed her death into an ongoing social and cultural event that lasted for months. Isabel had been a talented artist, and her family decided to continue her artistic education even after death. They would arrange her preserved corpse in different poses and settings each day, treating her like a life model for visiting artists who would come to the house to paint portraits of the beautiful dead girl in various romantic arrangements. But the truly elaborate part of the Beaumont family's mourning ritual was their nighttime routine. Isabel's mother would spend hours each evening preparing both herself and Isabel's corpse for bed, choosing complementary nightgowns and arranging their hair in matching styles. She'd position Isabel's arms around her as they slept, creating what she described as a peaceful embrace. Transcends the boundaries between life and death. The family also hosted regular evening conversations with Isabel, where friends and relatives would gather around the bed where mother and daughter slept together, discussing art, literature, and philosophy, while Isabel's corpse lay peacefully beside her living mother. These gatherings were considered the height of Parisian intellectual sophistication, combining grief, art, and social interaction in ways that epitomized French cultural refinement. German Victorian families took yet another approach, emphasizing the philosophical and spiritual dimensions of extended posthumous relationships. German mourning customs often included elaborate theoretical frameworks for understanding the continuing bonds between living and dead family members, with detailed explanations for how consciousness might persist after bodily death and how intimate physical contact could maintain spiritual connections. The Wagner family of Munich became famous throughout German intellectual circles for their systematic approach to posthumous family relationships. When their son Friedrich died of tuberculosis in 1882, they developed what they called a scientific protocol for maintaining family unity beyond mortality. Their approach involved careful documentation of all interactions with Friedrich's corpse, including detailed notes about his apparent responses to conversation, his preferred sleeping positions, and his reactions to different types of music and literature. Family members who slept beside Friedrich's preserved body were required to record their dreams and any unusual sensations they experienced during the night, creating an extensive archive of posthumous family communication. The Wagner family's records, donated to the University of Munich after the last surviving family member died in the 1920s, provide an incredibly detailed picture of how one German family lived with a dead relative for over 18 months. The documentation includes hundreds of pages of observations about Friedrich's corpse, sketches showing optimal positioning for posthumous bed sharing, and lengthy philosophical discussions about the nature of consciousness and family bonds. But perhaps the most interesting aspect of international variations in Victorian death customs was how different religious traditions influenced the specific practices that families adopted. Catholic families often incorporated religious rituals into their posthumous sleeping arrangements, treating their time with deceased relatives as a form of extended prayer or spiritual meditation. Protestant families were more unlikely to emphasize the educational value of sleeping with corpses, using the experience to teach children about mortality and spiritual preparation. Jewish families adapted the practices to fit within kosher laws and traditional mourning customs, creating unique hybrid approaches that honored both religious requirements and Victorian social expectations. The most elaborate religious integration probably occurred among wealthy American Catholic families, who sometimes hired priests to conduct regular bedside services for deceased relatives who were being kept at home for extended periods. These families would arrange their sleeping schedules around religious observances, timing their posthumous intimacy to coincide with prayers, masses, and other spiritual activities. The O'Sullivan family of Boston provides a particularly memorable example of Catholic Victorian mourning customs. When their youngest daughter Mary died of scarlet fever in 1883, they arranged for daily masses to be conducted in her bedroom, with family members taking turns sleeping beside her corpse between religious services. The arrangement became even more elaborate when the family decided to include Mary's corpse in their regular family prayers, positioning her preserved body so that she appeared to be kneeling alongside her living relatives during their evening devotions. The local priest, Father McKenna, apparently saw nothing inappropriate about this arrangement and actually praised the family for their devotion to maintaining Mary's participation in family spiritual life. The O'Sullivan family's posthumous sleeping arrangements continued for 4 months, ending only when Father McKenna was transferred to another parish and his replacement expressed some concerns about the theological implications of treating corpses as active participants in religious observances. Now, as we drift toward the end of the 19th century, it's important to understand that these elaborate Victorian death customs were gradually beginning to decline, though not necessarily for the reasons you might expect. The shift away from extended corpse keeping and posthumous sleeping arrangements wasn't primarily driven by medical concerns or changing attitudes toward death. Instead, it was largely the result of practical changes in how society was organized and how death was handled as a commercial and legal matter. The decline of Victorian corpse sleeping customs happened gradually. like watching a very slow, very morbid sunset. By the 1890s, several factors were converging to make extended posthumous domesticity less practical and less socially acceptable. Though plenty of families continued sleeping with their dead relatives well into the early 20th century, the first major challenge came from urbanization and changing living conditions. As more Victorian families moved into cities and smaller homes, the luxury of dedicating entire bedrooms to deceased relatives became increasingly difficult to maintain. Urban apartments simply didn't have the space for elaborate mourning arrangements, and city regulations were beginning to address the public health implications of keeping decomposing bodies in residential areas for extended periods. The rise of professional funeral services also began to compete with family-centered death customs. Funeral homes offered convenient alternatives to home-based corpse management, and they could provide preservation services that were often superior to what families could achieve on their own. More importantly, funeral directors were skilled at convincing bereaved families that professional death services were more dignified and appropriate than amateur posthumous domesticity. But perhaps the most significant factor in the decline of Victorian death customs was the emergence of new medical understanding about disease transmission and public health. As germ theory became more widely accepted, doctors began speaking out more forcefully about the health risks associated with prolonged intimate contact with corpses. Dr. Samuel Richardson's 1892 study, Domestic Death Customs and Their Health Consequences, provided the most comprehensive medical critique of Victorian mourning practices published during the era. His research included detailed case studies of families who had maintained extended sleeping arrangements with deceased relatives, and his findings were genuinely alarming. Even by Victorian standards, Dr. Richardson documented dozens of cases where families had contracted serious illnesses from their dead relatives, including several instances where multiple family members had died after sleeping with corpses that carried infectious diseases. His most disturbing case study involved the Morrison family of Glasgow, where a mother and 3 children had died of consumption within 6 months after maintaining sleeping arrangements with the father's corpse, which had apparently been infected with tuberculosis at the time of his death. The Morrison case became something of a causa célèbre in Victorian medical circles, partly because it demonstrated the potential for posthumous disease transmission, but also because it revealed how completely Victorian families could become psychologically dependent on their relationships with dead relatives. According to Dr. Richardson's notes, Mrs. Agnes Morrison had initially planned to keep her husband's corpse at home for just 1 week before burial, but she found the sleeping arrangement so comforting that she extended it indefinitely, eventually establishing a routine where she and her 3 young children took turns sleeping beside the increasingly decomposed body. The family maintained this arrangement for 4 months, during which time Mrs. Morrison became convinced that her husband was gradually recovering from his illness and would eventually return to consciousness. She developed elaborate theories about how his apparent death was just a temporary condition that required patience and devoted care to reverse. When Mrs. Morrison and her children began showing symptoms of consumption, she initially interpreted their illness as a sign that they were joining her husband in his temporary death-like state, and that they would all recover together as a family. She actually increased the amount of time the family spent sleeping with the corpse, believing that closer contact would accelerate their collective recovery. The situation only came to light when me, concerned about the smell coming from the Morrison house, contacted local authorities. By that time, Mrs. Morrison was too ill to resist when officials removed her husband's corpse for burial. But she died less than a week later, followed by her 3 children within the month. Dr. Richardson used the Morrison case to argue that extended, intimate contact with corpses wasn't just physically dangerous, but psychologically destructive in ways that could interfere with rational decision-making and basic self-preservation instincts. His recommendations included strict time limits for home-based mourning arrangements and mandatory medical oversight for families who wanted to keep deceased relatives at home for more than 48 hours. But medical concerns weren't the only factor driving changes in Victorian death customs. The First World War fundamentally altered society's relationship with death and mourning, creating new cultural contexts that made elaborate posthumous domesticity seem antiquated and inappropriate, often in circumstances where traditional mourning rituals were impossible. Families who lost sons and husbands in battle couldn't maintain sleeping arrangements with corpses that were buried in foreign battlefields or lost entirely. The scale of death during the war years forced society to develop more efficient, less intimate approaches to grief and mourning. Additionally, the war created a generation of survivors who had been exposed to death on an industrial scale, making the Victorian obsession with individual posthumous relationships seem almost quaint by comparison. Soldiers who had spent months sleeping in trenches surrounded by corpses often returned home with radically different attitudes toward death and the appropriate boundaries between the living and the dead. The post-war years also saw significant changes in religious attitudes toward death and mourning. Many Christian denominations began emphasizing the importance of accepting death as God's will and moving forward with life rather than maintaining elaborate, ongoing relationships with deceased relatives. The Catholic Church, in particular, began discouraging practices that seemed to interfere with the natural process of souls transitioning to the afterlife. But perhaps most importantly, the early 20th century brought new psychological understanding about grief and mourning that challenged Victorian assumptions about the benefits of prolonged intimate contact with corpses. Emerging psychiatric theories suggested that healthy grief processing required gradual separation from deceased loved ones rather than continued physical intimacy. Dr. Carl Jung's work on grief and mourning, published in the 1920s, specifically criticized Victorian death customs as psychologically harmful practices that interfered with the natural healing process. His theories about the importance of accepting death and integrating loss into conscious experience provided scientific support for critics who had long argued that sleeping with corpses was emotionally unhealthy. The combination of medical, religious, and psychological opposition to Victorian death customs created a perfect storm of social change that swept away centuries of traditional mourning practices within just a few decades. By the 1920s, the idea of sleeping with dead relatives had shifted from being a sign of proper devotion to being evidence of psychological instability or primitive superstition. Last documented case of extended Victorian-style corpse sleeping probably occurred in rural Kentucky in 1923, when the Campbell family maintained sleeping arrangements with their deceased grandmother for 6 weeks before local authorities intervened. Even then, the case was treated as a curiosity and a throwback to earlier, more primitive times rather than as a legitimate mourning practice. The Campbell family's arrangement was essentially identical to the elaborate Victorian death customs we've been discussing, complete with rotating sleeping schedules, daily grooming and dressing of the corpse, and inclusion of the deceased in family conversations and activities. But by 1923, these practices were seen as evidence of backwardness rather than sophistication. The newspaper coverage of the Campbell case reveals how completely social attitudes had shifted. Where Victorian newspapers had written admiringly about families who demonstrated devotion through elaborate mourning rituals, 1920s journalists treated the Campbells as amusing relics of a bygone era, objects of curiosity rather than respect. The final nail in the coffin of Victorian death customs, so to speak, was the rise of professional psychology and social work services that offered scientific alternatives to traditional grief processing. By the 1930s, bereaved families were more likely to seek counseling from trained professionals than to develop elaborate posthumous sleeping arrangements with their dead relatives. Modern funeral practices also became more standardized and efficient, removing most opportunities for extended home-based corpse-keeping. Professional embalming, climate-controlled funeral homes, and streamlined burial services made it both unnecessary and impractical for families to maintain their own domestic death arrangements. The result was that by the time World War II ended, the Victorian tradition of sleeping with dead relatives had essentially vanished from Western society, surviving only in scattered rural communities and immigrant populations who maintained traditional practices from their countries of origin. And yet, as we drift toward the end of our journey through this fascinating and deeply weird chapter of human history, it's worth remembering that the Victorian obsession with posthumous intimacy wasn't really about death at all. It was about love and family, and the desperate human desire to maintain connections with the people who matter most to us, even when those connections seem to violate the natural order of things. The Victorians, who spent weeks or months sleeping beside their dead relatives, weren't engaging in bizarre death cults or primitive superstitions. They were trying to extend relationships that had defined their lives, to maintain family bonds that seemed too precious to surrender to something as arbitrary as mortality. Their methods may seem strange to us now, but their motivations were entirely recognizable and deeply human in our modern world, where death has been largely removed from daily domestic life and relegated to professional institutions. We've gained efficiency and hygiene, but we've perhaps lost something important about the immediacy and intimacy of grief. Victorian families who slept with corpses experienced death as an immediate, physical, undeniable reality that had to be integrated into their daily lives rather than hidden away and processed by professionals. Whether that integration was psychologically healthy or medically safe is certainly debatable. But there's something to be said for a society that refused to treat death as an abstract concept or a distant possibility. For all their elaborate rituals and bizarre sleeping arrangements, The Victorians understood that death was a family matter, something that required intimate attention and personal involvement rather than professional management. So the next time you're drifting off to sleep in your comfortable, corpse-free bedroom, maybe take a moment to appreciate the simple luxury of sleeping alone with your own thoughts and dreams. And maybe, if you're feeling particularly grateful for modern funeral practices, spare a thought for all those Victorian families who found comfort and connection in arrangements that seem impossible to imagine today. After all, they were just trying to hold on to love for a little bit longer, even when love had to coexist with decomposition and grief had to find room to sleep beside death itself. And really, when you think about it that way, maybe their bizarre bedtime arrangements weren't so strange after all. Maybe they were just the logical extreme of something we all understand. The desperate wish that death doesn't have to mean goodbye. Sweet dreams, everyone. And be grateful that your biggest bedtime concern is probably just whether you remembered to set your alarm clock.